Good evening, everyone. My name is Ware Harmon. I'm the Executive Director of Town Hall Seattle. On behalf of Town Hall and our partners at Peter Miller Books, it's a pleasure to welcome you to tonight's appearance by Doug Kelbaugh. As we get underway, I want to acknowledge that our institution stands on the unceded traditional territory of the Coast Salish people, and particularly the Duwamish. We thank them for our continuing use of the natural resources of their ancestral homeland. And we thank you all for tuning in. Town Hall is grateful for the opportunity to invite audiences from Seattle and beyond into present tense exchanges of issues, ideas, and creativity, even when we can't do it together in person. Town Hall will continue to produce online content throughout this fall and into the new year, and as circumstances allow, to even host live streams from our building. Meanwhile, I wouldn't blame you for any Zoom or YouTube fatigue you may be feeling. You should know that many of our past talks are available in video or podcast form on our digital media library, including, actually, last weekend's wonderful events with historian Jill Lepore. Actually, you can just listen to them like a podcast and avoid the video altogether if you just can't stand more computer time. Anyway, back to tonight's event. The program will likely run about 60 minutes in all. After Doug's presentation, at about the 40-minute mark, he'll open up to your questions in the Q&A. Use the Ask a Question field at the bottom center of your screen. And as we like to say, keep your questions concise so Doug can answer as many as possible. Also, you can know that you can view the content both here on Crowdcast or over on our YouTube page, where you can use that platform's closed captioning feature. Town Hall adds new programs and podcasts every day, actually. Upcoming events that might be of interest include Senator Sherrod Brown in conversation with Executive Dow Constantine about the legacy of progressive senators who have shared Senator Brown's own desk number 88. Yolanda Strengers and Jenny Kennedy with a proposal for a needed update to our feminized digital assistants. The extraordinary music critics Alex Ross and Ann Powers together talking about art and politics and Wagner, as well as evenings with Michael Ian Black, Howard Gardner, and some once-in-a-lifetime conversations. Leila Lalami and Viet Thanh Nguyen, Ron Chu and Naomi Ishizaka, Steve Davis with Chelsea Clinton, Elizabeth Lesser with Jane Fonda. You'll find plenty more about most of the above already posted online at townhallseattle.org. Town Hall's work is made possible through your support and the support of our sponsors. Our Arno Matulski Science Series is supported by Microsoft, KUOW, the Wyncote Foundation Northwest, and the taxpayers of Washington State. But as most of you know, Town Hall is fundamentally a member-supported organization, and we're extremely grateful to all the members watching tonight. Town Hall and nonprofits at large have been put under significant strain with the event cancellations and the ever-changing financial landscape. We hope you will consider extending your generosity to help support us during this difficult time with a donation using the donate button at the bottom of your screen or by becoming a member. Meanwhile, our partner booksellers can use your support as well. If you're interested in going deeper into tonight's topic and helping out our local independent bookstores, please consider purchasing a copy of the book through the link on this live stream page and show some love to our fantastic partners at Peter Miller Books. All right, at last. Doug Kelbaugh is a professor of architecture and urban and regional planning. After 2 degrees from Princeton and an active professional practice that won a dozen design awards, Professor Kelbaugh served as architecture chair at the University of Washington and then dean of the University of Michigan's Taubman College of Architecture and Urban Planning. He won the 2016 Topaz Medallion, the highest award in architectural education. And he recently retired back to Seattle, where he will teach pro bono at the UW this academic year. He is the author and editor of many books, chapters, and articles. His books include Commonplace, Neighborhood and Regional Design in Seattle, published in 1997, as well as 2002's Repairing the American Metropolis, Commonplace Revisited. The former focused on how to develop community and sustainable spaces in the face of disjointed and fast-paced growth, and the latter expanded on it, expanding on new urbanism, a movement that Kelbaugh helped pioneer. His book, The Urban Fix, Resilient Cities in the War Against Climate Change, Heat Islands, and Overpopulation, is the subject of tonight's talk. Please join me in welcoming Doug Kelbaugh.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I see some familiar names on the roster. It's great to have you all here, and we're going to get right into this because there's a lot to cover. That's the title of the book and the talk tonight next. So this goes way back to 1973 when I designed this tram wall house, the first tram wall outside of France, in Princeton, New Jersey. Next. And this is the white roof with both photovoltaic and domestic hot water solar panels on our Mission condo, which we just sold recently before moving here. So the city as an organism, there's something called Kleiber's Law. You don't have to remember this, but it's pretty interesting. The number of heartbeats per lifetime. If you plot the mass of animals versus their metabolic rate, the result's a straight line from birds and rats and pigeons all the way up to bulls and elephants. And we fit on that line as well. Next. Yeah. It has a few discontinuities, but another way of looking at Kleiber's law is metabolism or heart rate increases more slowly than size or weight. So if you double the size of a city or a building, its energy consumption doesn't double. It goes up 70%, not 100%. This is good news. Next. So the city is an organism. If an elephant's just a scaled-up mouse, then a city is just a scaled-up elephant. The road surface area, the length of utility lines, gasoline stations, and sales, etc., increase slower. The metabolic rate literally slows down. But what's interesting, Kleiber's law is reversed when it comes to creativity and innovation. A metropolis that is 50 times bigger than a town is 130 times more innovative. More good news. Next. This is density and productivity. The denser a city, the more productivity. It goes up from 6 to 28% when you double density. Next. This is job density and per capita innovation rate, which is typically measured in patents per capita. So there's the job density on the left. In City B, there are twice as many jobs per square mile, and there are 20 to 20% more patents per capita. Next. So the thing about organisms is they all die. They have a finite number of heartbeats, finite lifetime. So all organisms die, including us, obviously. But ecosystems and cities don't die. So in fact, a city is also an ecosystem, not just an organism. Next. So this brings us to the city as an ecosystem, and I'll talk in this part about the environmental paradox of cities and the urban heat island effect. Next. So ecology spans from the organism at the bottom of this chart up to larger and larger creatures. But organisms all have a discrete lifetime. Ecosystems at the top are much, much longer lived. Next. So not everyone sees cities as natural or like a bird nest or as an ecosystem. We have this idea that there's the urban world and there's nature. We're the only species that looks at landscape that way. It's not like when a bird flies over Seattle, it goes, oh, I'm in a city now. It's a continuum in nature. So we have ruined a number of marshes to make our cities, but I think in this case, it was worth ruining that marsh for the city of Venice. Next. A few among us regret the loss of the ancient marshes on which Venice and Amsterdam sit, the loss of even more ancient, the hills that now seat Athens and Rome. Next. So there's some laws of the way cities scale up in size. As cities grow, the number of interactions increases at the square of the population. Wealth increases. But as cities get larger, there are fewer of them. And as cities get bigger, they get more sustainable. This is what I call the environmental paradox of cities. Next. Which is sort of the application of Kleiber's law. Next. So cities have huge footprints, energy footprints, carbon footprints, eco footprints. How can they be green ecologically? Well, here's the footprint of London. It takes about 125 times the land area of the city of London to support it, provide its food, and to take care of its waste stream, etc. Next. So Human settlements have two distinct negative impacts on the environment. They have a big eco footprint, as you just saw. They consume lots of resources and produce lots of waste, including greenhouse gases. And what happened here? Yeah, okay, it just flipped. New and expanding cities are even worse. A city like Dubai that's under constant constructions has an even bigger eco footprint. Next. So this is pretty vivid. It shows at the top urban and rural in 2010 versus 2040. Cities consume most of the world's energy now, and it's going to get even more so, even more dominant in the future. Next. So what's the environmental paradox? Next. Whoops. Can't quite see that. Ah, there we go. So this is a map of Chicago, one on the left, one on the right. One on the left shows the amount of greenhouse gases produced. And as you can see down at the center on the right, down near the core of the city, there's a lot more greenhouse gases produced. And as you go out through these city neighborhoods into the inner suburbs and the outer suburbs and even out to the rural areas, there's a lot less greenhouse gas produced per acre. But on the right, and this was a big breakthrough, if you divide it by the number of people, you see that in fact on the right, that city dwellers produce relatively low amounts of greenhouse gases compared to suburbanites or ruralites. This is good news as the world urbanizes. And how is that energy used? In a low density area in the top bar, suburbia, rural areas. Red represents how much energy spent on transportation, obviously a lot of driving. Purple is heating, lighting, and cooling buildings, which are freestanding in low density areas and take more energy to heat. And green is materials. That's the amount of energy embodied in the materials that make that building and also erecting that building. Versus a city, a high density area on the lower bar, you can see everything. Transportation is much less, as are building operations and materials. Less building materials needed when you have shared floors, roofs, and ceilings in a multifamily housing, for instance. Next. It's the vehicles that make the biggest difference, though. And this is New York City, and you can see how many more vehicles there are per person as you get out from the inner 5 boroughs into the inner suburbs and the outer suburbs. The vehicles per person go way up. Next. That'd be true in Seattle too. So technically, this is the definition of the environmental paradox of cities. When people cluster in dense mixed-use cities rather than in sprawl, they have a big ecological footprint, but their ecological footprint per capita is smaller than in places like suburbia. So cities may not look as green as the suburbs or the hinterland, but they are in fact greener than they look. So all that economic investment in buildings and infrastructure is a good eco investment. Look at Atlanta on the left and Barcelona on the right. They're both about 2.5 million people. And look at the size of Atlanta's footprint versus Barcelona. It's a huge difference. And then if you look at the third set of variables there, transport carbon emissions, 7.5, it doesn't matter, the units, 7.5 in Atlanta versus 0.7 in Barcelona. So over 10 times as much CO2 and other greenhouse gases from transportation in Atlanta. A second negative impact of cities is that they have a lot of tailpipe and chimney emissions that not only produce greenhouse gases, but also just plain hot air, sensible heat. This is about the local climate, nothing to do with climate change. It's called the urban heat island effect. And it is true, as this cross-section at the top shows, downtown is hotter than inner neighborhoods and then outer neighborhoods and then the suburbs and the countryside. Quite a difference in many cases. The urban heat island is the buildup of sensible heat from hot tailpipe and chimney exhausts, and also from all the dark rooftops and parking lots and streets that get heated up by the sun and then heat the air immediately above them. Next. So it's a double whammy. You get the greenhouse effect in the city plus the heat island effect, whereas in rural areas, it's just the greenhouse effect. Back to Atlanta. This is the size of the so-called heat island over a 21-year period. Is quite out of date, so you can imagine it's much worse now. But during that time, Atlanta lost about half its tree cover. Seattle's lost about a third of its tree canopy. Next. Now, these are the surface temperatures we're talking about, not air temperatures, but the temperatures of rooftops and surfaces. And you can see on the left, the inner city, how much hotter it is compared to the transect across the city to the rural areas on the right. It's dramatic. And indeed, cities can get very hot. Next. This is the delta, the temperature difference between urban and rural. And it's a function of the sort of albedo, which is the amount of reflected heat, and then also the waste heat, which is just the hot air in the city. Next. It's a pretty big difference. Large cities in the U.S. tend to be warming at more than twice the rate of the planet as a whole, and as a result of the loss of naturally vegetated land covers. Global estimates of climate change are likely to underestimate the rates of warming in the very places where most of our human population dwell, which is in the city. Next. Next. Here are some examples of hot cities. Louisville, for some reason, is the hottest. It's also politically quite hot right now, as you know. Atlanta's hot, Detroit's very hot, and so on. This is heat in excess of the rural areas that surround them. And it can be a big difference indeed. And this is about the increase on this chart. It shows it's getting worse and worse. Next. And unfortunately, the hottest areas are usually the poorest parts of the cities. This is Oakland. You can see the wealthier people live in the sort of upper right, and that's the least hot place in terms of surface temperature. And the poor people in the bottom area are living in the hottest part of the city. Obviously, less trees, more pavement, etc. Next. So if ways to mitigate and adapt to urban heat islands also address climate change, how might heat islands actually help us solve our more global problem of an overheating planet? Because this is important in my thesis and in the book, because urban heat islands are manageable. They can be dealt with in a 5 to 10 year range rather than a 50 to 100 year range like climate change. It can better motivate people to modify their behaviors because there's the more immediate feedback, more palpable results. So they are willing, it's less abstract and distant than climate change. So it motivates people. Next. And the lucky good news is that strategies to mitigate and address urban heat islands are consistent with strategies to deal with climate change. In fact, they're identical. Next. So how do we deal with urban heat islands and indirectly climate change? Well, albedo, that's the reflectivity, a fancy name for that. It's lighter colored roofs, pavements, and walls. Next. So a lighter colored pavement can be 4 times more reflective than a dark pavement. This is a dramatic difference. Next. Color is a big deal. Black obviously gets a lot hotter. Next. Lighter colored pavement is cooler, as you know from walking around. Next. And the amount of pavement's a big deal. This happens to be Detroit in the upper left. Look at all that parking area in downtown, and look at the parking in Houston in the lower left. The chart on the right shows that about 60% of the city is either street or parking lots. And only 4% of this downtown is green. And only 36% is actually buildings. The photo of Houston was so embarrassing to its local town fathers that they ended up building a bunch of arenas in the lower left-hand portion of that photo. Next. Well, when it comes to rooftops, what's cheaper than white paint or a white roofing material? A white membrane. A white roof bounces again 4 times as much energy back into outer space, and it actually can reduce rainfall in some cases, which is good and bad. Anyway, a light roof, you can't beat it. Here's some engineering students from Princeton painting a roof white. It cuts the local air temperature about 1 degree Fahrenheit, which cuts mortality in that neighborhood by about 5%. Next. So green roofs, you know about them. You've seen them with grass and plants and food production. They do a good job at cooling the building and cooling the air in the city, but white roofs are 3 times more effective at countering climate change than planted roofs. Green roofs, of course, have other benefits like food production and stormwater management, but they're much, much more expensive than a white roof. Next. So waste heat reduction is the next one, other than reflectivity. Next, you can see just having less auto-dependent cities where people walk and bike more and take more transit, less waste heat from vehicles. Next. That's Portland. And less air conditioning. All those air conditioners are cooling off living spaces, but they're heating up the city. Air conditioners, as you know, pump a lot of hot air into the streets. And they have chemicals within them, which are greenhouse gases. Unfortunately, the world is investing heavily, particularly the developing world now, in air conditioners. It's a major, major increase in greenhouse gases. Next. So the urban section, that's like the cross section of a street. The narrower that is, and the darker the surface colors on the sidewalks and the roadway, but also on the sides of the building, the worse it is. So you want to lighten them up. You want to widen them, not make them too tall. Manhattan obviously has big problems with urban heat islands because they trap heat. Next. There are interesting ways to deal with that. This is a radical proposal by some grad students at Berkeley to do all the cross streets, or as many as possible in Manhattan, with a shading device that also is a power plant. Each street producing an immense amount of energy. 18 megawatts is, I don't know, I think 3 or 4 streets is like a small coal-powered power plant. And of course, they reduce the heat by shading up to 70%, and they're beautiful. They can be a hanging garden with aroma and adding a unique identity. They can't be too dense or they'll make the street too dark, obviously. Next. Believe it or not, this is Beijing, which has a lot of dirty air, but there's also a lot of hot air. They are actually planning on, I mean, they may have already started tearing down some buildings to get more wind corridors to flush that dirty, hot air out of their city. That's how bad it is. Next. Lastly, and most interestingly, and I think welcome to everybody in the audience, is what are called cool microclimates, which are basically planting trees and vegetation to shade and filter and cool the air. And if you look at trees, they just have an amazingly long list of positive tasks they produce. I won't read them, but they are the great multitaskers, one of the great wonders of the world. Next. And it's just the sheer beauty of trees. I hope we're doing okay on time. I don't know. Next. Yeah, we're doing fine. Here are some of my favorite trees I've taken photos of from around the world. And they are amazing creatures. Next. Most of you probably don't know this, but trees actually talk to each other by sending chemicals through their root system to each other. And a mother tree actually helps a child tree that it's spawned in times of trouble. It will send it help, and vice versa. It's an astounding finding by scientists recently. Next. Urban trees get a lot bigger than they do in a forest because they have less competition from neighboring trees. So they mitigate climate change 16 times more than a non-urban tree. They really are quite cathedral-like in many cases. This is, as I recall, a street in Buenos Aires on the right and Vietnam on the left. Trees in Metro Chicago provide an estimated $350 million of value in annual carbon storage. Next. A tree in front of a Portland house added $3,500 to $7,000 to its sale price. It's probably more now, but more than $22,000 in a mixed-use walkable neighborhood with tree-lined streets. People will pay more for trees. Next. Here are attempts to green cities as have been in Milan, Bosco Verticale, the vertical forest. You see more and more of this. It's an expensive way to add green. Frankly, you're better off in terra firma, but it just shows you how important it is to people. Next. The problem is when you got a crane there under construction, it's no problem. It isn't a problem to put a tree up, and when it dies, it needs replanting. 30 years later, you don't have a crane, so it's not the most sustainable proposition. Next. So good old green oases like Central Park in Manhattan are hard to beat. Trees in terra firma. Next. So we are way ahead of schedule. The review of our 5 big ideas today. Cities are a social place. They're bikeable, they're walkable, they're sittable. Great for face-to-face interaction with friends and with strangers. They actually enable you to connect to people you don't know. The city as an organism, it's productive and inventive, as we saw in those per capita numbers about patents. And the city is not only an organism, it's an ecosystem, which is much longer lived, and it's able to evolve, as you know. I mean, think how long Athens and Rome and Cairo have been around. We talked about the environmental paradox of cities, how they are much greater than they look, and how the urban heat island can be dealt with, particularly with greenery. Next. So why cities and urban design are so important? Well, we have to deal with climate change. It is the greatest challenge ever to face humanity, in my opinion. And it turns out that mixed use, that is places that have lots of different uses in walking distance, that are served by transit, have lower carbon footprints per capita. And the bigger and denser the city, the better. Cities also dampen birth rates, which lowers humanity's total carbon footprint, because it's not only per capita footprint we care about it, we care about the number of humans on the planet, and there are too many of us. The planet really can't support 7.8 billion of us, and the population is still growing rapidly, particularly in Asia. And the good news there is when people move from the countryside to the city, their birth rate goes down and their footprint goes up because they get wealthier, but their birth rate goes down faster than their footprint goes up. So cities are doing a lot to deal with the total carbon footprint. That's not just in Asia, that's all over the world, but that's where it's most dramatic now. I mean, we've already migrated to cities here in the US and in Europe, but it's happening a lot also in Africa now, and of course, South America too. So as urban heat islands get hotter, the problem is less people move to cities, and some people don't even want to stay in cities. So we got to deal with urban heat islands while simultaneously addressing climate change, which require the same strategies and tactics. Because urban heat islands are a more immediate and manageable problem than climate change, this is one of my big arguments, they can more effectively and compellingly motivate people to act on climate change, which is the big challenge. So voila, cities may be our last best hope. I think there are maybe a couple more slides next. Well, this is the book. Thank you, and I hope you consider buying it from Peter Miller Books. So I guess we're ready for Q&A, which I'm happy to manage. Here I am at my house in Madrona. And how do we do this? I'm not sure I can see these questions.
Hey, Doug, we're going to have Candace come in and do the Q&A.
Oh, good. Thank you, Candace.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you so much for that presentation. I want to remind people that you can submit a question. If you're watching on YouTube, you can also submit a question there and we'll bring it over. But the first one I have here is from Michaela. And their question is, how do you balance adding density to a city, often vertically, and the effect of heat trapping between buildings, like in Manhattan?
Well, it is true. Taller buildings closer together, trap heat. You can spread towers out. I mean, actually, there's not that much super deep heat canyons in Seattle. Downtown has some, of course, but it's nothing like Manhattan. And then the neighborhoods have 5, 6, 10-story buildings. In the inner neighborhoods, they don't trap that much heat. And of course, the rural hinterland is fine. But even in a place like Madrona, or where my daughter Tess, who I see is on the list tonight, lives down in Columbia City, there's very little heat trap there. It's more from pavements and rooftops than from urban canyons or street canyons.
Yeah, one of the things that you mentioned, sort of shorter buildings. We have a lot of that in Seattle. I think one of the things we're seeing though is the rapid growth suddenly that we have, which is, I suppose, good, right? Because it's creating more density.
Density is good. Yeah, people don't like it, but frankly, it
people don't
means
like
more
it.
people walking, less people driving. And
Yeah.
more people biking. A lot of bikers. I bike every other day, 30 and 20 miles here in Seattle, and there are bikers everywhere.
Yeah, and I think it does seem like it's also a battle for parking. People, that's a big thing here, that people are not super willing to give up.
That's not just Seattle. That's
Yeah.
all over the urbanized world, parking, because cars take up about 20 times as much space as a pedestrian does. And so they're a problem. They're big.
Right. Yeah, I was struck by the image, the graph that you showed, kind of reversing what I think we often think of, greenhouse gas emissions from a city being so much more than a rural setting. But thinking about it per capita flips that on its head a little bit. It got me thinking about the sort of mental block that we have, not to put down people that live in rural areas, but I think we see maybe they actually have a little more responsibility with their carbon footprint.
Well, people who live in rural areas produce food. The suburbs are a bigger problem because they don't really produce any food, and they use an immense amount of energy to heat and light and cool the individual freestanding single-family dwellings. And Americans have by far the biggest transportation footprints on the planet. We're the only country in the world where transportation is the biggest slice of the energy pie or the carbon pie. we travel a lot more, primarily by private vehicle. So the suburbs are leading that charge big time. American suburbanites are frankly a problem for the planet. And I think the third world, the developing world, has been rather generous to us. I think at some point they're going to say, hey, wait a minute, America, get your act together. We're paying the price.
Yeah, that makes me think of something I've been kind of questioning for a little bit now. I don't know what put this into my head, but when I think about climate change, it strikes me that there are so many other issues attached to it. And I've been thinking about, what's the root of why we can't seem, to get anything done to actually make a change. And I wonder if it is in part that we just don't value everyone the same. We don't value humans all the same. And maybe if we did,
yeah, no, we have to get
change.
a lot more aggressive. But the truth of the matter is we're much better off than our parents or than we were 5 or 10 years ago. Our buildings are much more efficient. We tend to live in denser patterns of development, and we are driving less, and our cars are more efficient and so on. We're about to put solar collectors on our roof and get an electric vehicle. So we're getting better, but we're not getting better fast enough, particularly in America, because we've started in such a deep hole, even compared to Europeans who live as well as we do. We have about a 40% bigger footprint than the average European. But compared to a place like India or Bangladesh, it's sad how they pay the price and produce very little greenhouse gas and live very, very modestly.
Yeah. I've got a question here from Holly. She's asking, how important is permeable concrete?
Permeable concrete is definitely a step forward, and they also make permeable asphalt. That helps a lot with runoff. Runoff's a problem. It's an environmental problem, not so much a climate change problem, but definitely an environmental problem. So I think it's important. Having a lighter color pavement actually is more important to me than permeability, because climate change is a bigger deal than wastewater management.
Interesting. Here's a question coming over from YouTube from Will. He's asking, do you see mass adoption or incentivization of building standards like passive house as a solution, given that heating and cooling of housing makes up such a large chunk of our energy use?
Yeah, buildings are a huge chunk, 40% by many measures of our footprint. Passive house is a system of extremely heavily insulated, airtight houses that came out of Germany. I think they're overdone, frankly. But we definitely could make our buildings more defensive, that is, better insulated with better windows, less heat loss through the shell of the building, but also less air infiltration and so on. So there's a lot to learn, but frankly, to get a building up to the standards of passive house takes a lot of money. You'd be better off spending an equal increment of money invested into, say, 3 or 4 houses, getting them to 80%, or rather than one house to 100%, because you get to the point of diminishing returns. To get to that last 5-10% is very expensive. So we're much better off improving performance by 75-80%. I mean, not improving performance, but achieving that kind of efficiency. That's a major misunderstanding, that anytime you get anything up to 100%, there's a law of diminishing returns. You just don't do very well.
This question is from Gordon. The question is, with many people in cities, at least in the US, currently working from home, what long-term impacts to dense cities and mass transit systems do you think we'll see from the pandemic?
Well, the pandemic is helping. There's no doubt about it. I think more working from home is good. The bus system here is quite good. The rail system is pretty skimpy, actually. So I think buses are going to tend to be the major public transit in this city. But the more the better, and the more rail the better. But, driving smaller cars, shorter distances, walking more, frankly, is even better than taking transit. I mean, we often walk or bike, or I have an e-bike. I take the e-bike to grocery outlet to get my food. And it's extreme. Frankly, an e-bike is, compared to an automobile, is dramatically better. Electric cars are going to be better, and they're getting even cheaper and more efficient. So yes, transit is very important. TODs, transit-oriented development, is one of the ideas that I helped pioneer, starting with a design charrette at the University of Washington about, 30 years ago. Transit, you can't have too good a transit system. And the Europeans, by the way, have known that for a long time, have wonderful transit, and we're getting better. But we're more spread out, so transit's not quite as cost effective in spread out cities. But as we densify, transit becomes more viable.
Do you think that as a result of us being able to stay home, or maybe more of us, even after the pandemic is over, transitioning to working from home will, sort of make funding for those systems not as urgent for politicians?
Well, we look out our window at the number 2 bus line, and I noticed it's very dependent on the time of day. There are times of day when the bus is really full, even with COVID. And there are other times of day it's practically empty. So, COVID is a challenge, but that's not going to last forever. And even though it's not going to probably go away for a long time, we're going to learn how to deal with it better. And vaccine, et cetera, might really dramatically improve the situation. But no, transit's not going away because of COVID. But yeah, it's challenged right now.
I haven't ridden the bus in a very long time, and I used to ride it every day.
But I'm surprised how many people do. Of course, they're all spaced out and they all have masks on.
Mm-hmm.
So when I say full, they're not literally full,
Right.
but they're sort of maxed out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I actually miss it. I mean, I miss riding the bus. It was a nice time in between. So this question's from Daniel. He's asking, is solar installation on a roof absorbing light as a good white, is it as good as a white reflecting roof?
Well, a white roof is, of course, much, much cheaper. In fact, we're debating whether to put collectors up on a roof because it's hard to get the tilt high enough. It turns out almost all the installers we've talked to have really low tilt solar collectors, and that's a problem because we have, at our latitude, a relatively low angle of incidence from the sun, particularly in the fall and winter and spring. And so collectors requiring a steeper tilt are more complex in terms of securing them against wind and even snow. So it's solar collectors are great if you have a sloping roof facing within 20 degrees of due south. Then I think they make a lot of sense. On a flat roof, it depends on how steep you can make the collectors. As I showed you very early in the presentation of our roof in Ann Arbor, Michigan, which had a white roof with those collectors, the steeply tilted one was for hot water. The others, though, were relatively low tilt. And the rationale was that they're a lot easier to put in. You don't have to penetrate the roof. They're just held on by weights because there's not that much wind resistance. And they take advantage of the sunnier weather in the summer, which is true here as well. So it is true that it can be lower tilt than, say, domestic hot water, because you need that 365 days a year. But it's only because we have net metering, reverse metering, so that all that extra sun that was collected on our roof in Michigan, and would be true here as well, all that summer sun, you get a credit. You reverse your meter and you get a credit in the winter. So it makes sense. And utilities can do that as long as they need more renewable energy. But at some point, once they get enough renewable energy, they're not going to reverse meter. But for the foreseeable future, it's a lot better. It's a lot more workable with these lower tilted panels, because it favors the summer, and as long as utilities are willing to take all that extra energy that your house can't use and give you a credit back in the winter, it's fine. It's still better to get as much tilt as you can, though.
Yeah, that's interesting. I wouldn't have thought of that. So here's a question from Clint. He says, Doug, is there an
person?
It is, yeah.
I remember Clint.
Nice.
From when we lived here 22 years ago.
Oh, great. Thanks for being with us, Clint. So his question is there an optimal scale and density that balances density with heat island effect, transportation efficiency, etc.? Is it high-rise scale, like the denser parts of Vancouver or Hong Kong, or something more like mid-rise, 6-7 story development like Paris, or relatively tight-knit, leafy, single-family neighborhoods like Wallen?
Yeah, well, certainly Paris is a better model, but the actual net density between Paris and Vancouver isn't that different. Vancouver is pretty good because, as you know, often the tower's in the middle of the block and there are lower townhouses around the perimeter. So I think Vancouver does density well, but it is a trade-off. Manhattan is not optimum. So I think the sort of construction we see in Seattle now, these 5 to 8 story elevator buildings, often 5 stories, 4/1, which is cheaper to build because of code regulations. They're very effective at achieving the density that will support walkability and support transit. So 4, 5, 6 stories is plenty. Paris is really 7 or 8 on average. So anything in that range is good, but you don't need to have towers. But if they're spaced out, the shading is not so bad. It's a trade-off. So it's hard to be too dense, frankly. I don't think we have to worry about that. Hong Kong does, and there's some other Asian cities that need to worry about that, and some South American cities, but I don't think that's an immediate problem for us, particularly if we have a lot of street trees. It really helps.
Yeah. I've got 2 questions here I'm going to try to combine. One is from Anne, and she is asking, can you speak to the impact of our exurban roadway infrastructure and ways to improve the albedo? And then Holly's asking, how expensive is light pavement versus dark pavement?
Well, I don't know if light pavement, I mean, a lot of the old streets in Seattle are concrete. That's light enough. Concrete is more expensive than asphalt. Asphalt's the cheapest paving, so that's an issue. But, they're painting the streets white in LA as we speak. Literally, people are going out, and the city's going out and painting them white. It won't last forever, but it'll last quite a while. So I think there are ways to more cheaply whiten and lighten street surfaces. But what was the first question? It was,
can you speak to the impact of the exurban roadway infrastructure and ways to improve?
Exurban, you mean rural? Or is that what it's?
Exurban, I mean, yeah, in my mind, that's like the space
Suburbia
is
and
just
so
outside.
on. Well, the
Yeah,
streets
just
in
outside.
suburbia are far, far too wide, as you know. You could
Yeah.
easily park on both sides, and usually there's no parking allowed or no parking, in fact. So they could be probably half the width on average as they are in American suburbia. Frankly, the paving industry has a pretty good lock on local politicians. Local politicians don't get lobbied by many groups, unlike state and national politicians. And frankly, the only local industry with deep pockets is the road industry. And so they have they have a sort of inordinate amount of clout because of their giving. And in many cases, it's honest, open. In some cases, it's more corrupt. But that's one of the reasons we overpave, unfortunately. And asphalt being cheap, short-lived, and heat absorbing is the other big issue. But Seattle actually has narrower streets than many cities. Actually, Seattle's much better than, say, Detroit, where the streets, I mean, you could lie down and take a nap in the middle of most of the streets in Detroit. They're so wide. So Seattle's by far, is far from the worst. But the exurban areas of Seattle, the suburban areas, are definitely worse than the city, definitely. And it also encourages higher speeds. They say the thing that really determines how fast cars go is not the posted speed limit, but the width of the right of way. And the faster they go, the more energy they consume, the more per mile they produce more greenhouse gases, and they also kill more people. I saw a 2-hour documentary, I mean, a webinar today on pedestrian safety in American cities, and Americans kill pedestrians at a far higher rate than, say, Europeans. It's because cars are going faster. And our streets are wider. They're harder for pedestrians to cross, particularly the suburban arterial strips. Impossible to cross on foot.
Right. Yeah. And the blocks are so long.
Yeah, blocks are too long. That's one of Jane Jacobs, the great urban pioneer. One of her great points is you want short blocks. So there are more routes to get from A to B.
Makes me think of the cancellation of the study into self-driving cars because of a pedestrian fatality. Do you see that in our future?
Well,
reasonably?
self-driving cars, I think, are further off than industry might suggest. Yeah, you know, they're good about. They can get them to a significant or acceptable level of safety for 80-90% of the trips, even 95. It's that 5% though that ends up killing people. So I think it's going to be slower, if ever, to happen.
Yeah.
There may be, I think what will happen, as Peter Calthorpe has shown in his studies in California, there will be corridors with autonomous vehicles, autonomous buses and vans and so on, but they're in dedicated right-of-ways. They're not roaming the city. It's a very efficient system, in fact.
It'll be interesting to see. So this question is from Bill, who's watching on YouTube. Going back to a comment I think you made earlier about overpopulation. He says, why is overpopulation an issue? As you suggested, it is in Asia when North Americans use vastly more energy per capita. Isn't that just blaming the global South for their greed?
Well, no, I was trying to lay the blame on us, but the problem with developing countries, they're growing extremely fast and they're getting wealthy fast, which is good. It's good that the middle class is expanding. But with that goes goes eco footprints as well. So statistically, the developing world is not trivial at all, and it's getting bigger and bigger. So because it's growing faster, I think is why I've talked about it. But Americans, I said many times, and I'll repeat, are the biggest offenders. Europeans are better, but they still have pretty big eco footprints, per capita. So I think we all have to pull our weight, but in many ways, the questioner is correct. We have a greater obligation to act than some rural villager moving to a city in China or India. And again, those people aren't to be penalized. It's just we have to recognize, because there's so many hundreds of millions of them, it's an issue now. I mean, it's a good issue. It's a good problem to have.
This question is from Owen. I think it's kind of interesting. How does the specific climate around cities, for example, Phoenix, in a sweltering desert, affect their energy efficiency? Is there a scenario where cities in certain areas or latitudes take up so much energy to cool with a rising population that it offsets the efficiency gains that density provides? And do you foresee
good question. I mean,
do you see the one last part to it? Do you foresee the future of urban growth only feasible in higher latitudes?
This is a major issue because the bulk of the fast-growing cities are in hot tropical areas where heat islands are becoming unbearable. So a city like Phoenix has a huge air conditioning load per capita, and it drives a lot as well. Phoenix is a pretty horrible example of how not to build cities, and probably where not to build cities. But humid cities, hot humid cities, are even worse because they require even more air conditioning. So a place like Houston is worse than Phoenix. This is a big problem. More people are moving to the south. Excuse me. Now, it's true that they have less heating load, but their air conditioning load goes up dramatically. And in many cases, if you move from Seattle to Phoenix, your total annual footprint would go up, because we don't have that big a heating or cooling load here. It would depend, though, in some cases, moving from a really cold city, say Edmonton, Canada, down to Phoenix wouldn't be such a bad trade at all, because it's so cold up there. So it's a balance. It depends on what cities you're comparing and what density you're talking about within that city, and etc.
Well, we're getting close to an hour, so I'm just going to ask a couple more questions. This one's from Casey, maybe. It seems like tree canopy and densification are at odds in Seattle and in other cities. How can we protect the growth canopy while encouraging infill and density? What's the right balance between stick and carrot?
I think street trees are completely compatible with dense development. I mean, even Manhattan has a lot of street trees, but 5-story development with street trees are fine. We're not talking about urban forests, although it's great to have parks. We're talking about street trees. If every street in Seattle had a row of street trees, it'd be a lot better. For instance, Columbia City, I was talking about earlier, there aren't so many street trees. Here in Madrona, there are plenty. In general, Seattle has a pretty good pattern of street trees. It's not as good, though, as many European cities and some other American cities. The cover of my book is actually Buenos Aires, amazing cathedrals of street trees in that city, and that's certainly true in many other cities in Europe and America. So pretty good here in Seattle, but we could be better. Certainly in parts of this city, we could be a lot better. And these have to be big, spreading trees. And if they touch in the middle of the street, all the better. Although it's a dark city, we have to be a little careful about blocking too much light here. But in general, we want big canopies.
I wonder if we can go back to sort of a current topic again, and cover the sort of the bigger picture and why you think climate change is a bigger challenge than the things that we're facing now, COVID, that kind of thing.
Well, I mean, I think overpopulation, which is connected to climate change, is really big. Climate change is immense because it's unstoppable. We can slow it down. We cannot reverse it or stop it. It's only going to get worse. Our kids and grandkids are in for a very wild ride. In fact, our kids are in for a wild ride. Our grandkids are in for a horrible ride. All the statistics and the scientists are in total agreement about this. I mean, 90.97.5% of them agree that it's caused by humans, it's irreversible, and it's accelerating. We can see it already. The forest fires on the West Coast are definitely connected to climate change. So I don't know of a bigger challenge ever. COVID is a big deal. Maybe several million Americans will die, but it's nothing compared to heat deaths around the planet. And in some of the southern parts of the U.S. are getting pretty bad as well. Heat waves in the summer kill a lot of people, particularly older people and younger people, but elderly are really hit hard. So that's going to get worse. And if people aren't necessarily killed by heat waves, many of them are impaired or severely limited. So it's not just the heat, though, the hot air we're worried about. Climate change is a lot more than heat. It's bringing on extreme weather, forest fires, and these second and tertiary effects that are as bad or worse than actual hot air. I do think it's the biggest challenge ever to face humanity, and it's going to get worse, and it's going to get worse fast. Whereas COVID will come and go, we'll have other viruses and other epidemics and pandemics, and frankly, they're aggravated by hotter weather. So heat will also bring on more disease. So it's all interconnected.
I think I'll end on this last question that people are voting up from Steve. He's asking, how can we minimize displacement of lower income households when densification and upzoning occurs?
This is a problem. It's not a new problem. It's been going on since ancient Rome and ancient Greece. The wealthy people always want to move to the more desirable places and they can afford to do it, so they tend to displace people. It's been going on forever. It's a problem in a city like Seattle because it's an expensive city to live in. Houses cost a lot to rent or to buy, and so it's easier to displace people in a way. But it's happening all throughout American cities, but it's happening all over the world. I mean, I think it's just part of economics. It goes beyond capitalism, by the way. It's true in any market economy. Better things, better places, better homes get bid up in value. And so there's a natural tendency for gentrification to happen. The key is, how do you gentrify without displacing? And there's some cities that do better at that than others, that allow neighborhoods to improve without forcing the poor people out. Often it takes government programs, though, local, state, and federal programs to help those poor people stay in place. But many cities are doing that, not just in the U.S., but elsewhere. So it will take some intervention, because this is not a sort of recent temporary effect. This is just human nature, and not the displacement, but moving up. Doing as well as you can with the available capital you have is human nature. People aren't going to stop doing that. So that requires intervention in the market. The market cannot solve that problem by itself. And I will end on that.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Doug. I feel like there is a lot of optimism actually in this talk, and thank you for bringing your wealth of knowledge about the urban.
Well, I mean, cities may be our last best hope. That's the title of my final chapter. Nice. They will do more to deal with climate change and these other issues than anything I know of.
Great. Well, thank you all for watching. I want to encourage you to buy a copy of The Urban Fix from the Buy the Book button or the link on the YouTube page. If you want to follow more Town Hall content, you can click the follow button in the top right corner of the screen and see what's coming up. And yeah, thank you so much again, Doug, and we'll see you again soon.
Good luck to everybody out there. Good night.